Hi everybody, my name is Leah. My channel is Common Sense Ethics. Just a reminder that if you enjoy this video, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the fact that conservatism as a political philosophy is actually a defense of liberalism and of liberal democracy and not the enemy of liberalism, right? So conservatism is the branch of liberalism that tries to conserve the liberal democratic state against the corrosive effects of liberalism itself. And I'll explain exactly what that means. Conservatism as a political philosophy also seeks to defend liberal democracy against leftism and reactionism, which really seek to overthrow liberalism entirely. And this needs to be better understood, right? Because you have, at least in the United States, half the population at loggerheads with the other half. When really, people need to realize that liberals and conservatives are actually natural allies against illiberal extremism from the right and the left. I really hate using the terms right and left. I don't think they're descriptive enough, but if you don't use them, then no one understands what you're talking about. But anyway, first let's define some terms. What is liberalism? I'm not defining it only in the narrow sense that it's used in contemporary American politics, but I'm using it really also in the philosophical and historical sense. So liberalism is a political and moral philosophy based on liberty, consent of the governed, reason, and equality before a secular law. It originated during the Enlightenment with the philosopher John Locke, who was writing in the late 17th century. He is usually credited with being the father of modern liberalism. So one thing that I really would like to highlight in this video is that conservatism arose historically to defend liberalism against the inherent flaws contained within liberalism itself. That actually makes conservatism a branch of liberalism rather than its adversary. So the father of modern conservatism was the British statesman Edmund Burke. He wrote in the late 18th century, and he was actually a Whig, which was the Liberal Party of the day, and he was also an abolitionist. But he was horrified by what happened during the French Revolutionary Terror, where thousands of people were guillotined. And he spoke out against it, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. So, what are these fatal flaws within liberalism as a political philosophy? There are three that I'm going to talk about today. There are probably more, so feel free to comment if you think I've forgotten anything. But liberalism as a philosophy emphasizes tolerance and equality and the freedom of the individual. But if these principles are taken to their logical extremes and not constrained in some way, you have what happened during the French Revolution. So basically, liberalism's desire to free the individual will culminate in moral disorder unless the liberal democratic state retains some of the traditions and institutions which have allowed this philosophy to thrive to begin with. If that doesn't happen, then, you have nothing but raw power to occupy the vacuum. At least that's what conservatives think. So Burkean conservatism seeks to defend the social order against what it sees as an excess of individualism within liberalism. So Burke thought that you can't, in the name of progress, sweep away everything that has come before in a society without consequence. So he was in favor of what he called ordered liberty, that for liberty to flourish, right, and for social and personal order and morality to exist, that radical innovations must be shunned, which will lead me right into the next point. So the second fatal flaw within liberalism is its emphasis with its emphasis on equality and individualism, it's kind of seen as nasty, right, to judge other people's culture or lifestyle or to have a hierarchy of values. So if that's the case and you don't really want to commit to a hierarchy of moral values or anything like that, then everything is sort of relative. And paradoxically, this makes you unable to defend liberalism or essential liberal democratic values like freedom of speech, which may be one of the reasons that we see freedom of speech is going down the toilet today. So the conservative insight here is that liberalism needs to be understood as a certain inheritance of a specific place, culture, and set of laws, right? The law, English law, going back centuries, is really a tradition in and of itself that helped to give rise to this philosophy of liberalism. And liberal democracy has really only existed for about 250 years, and that's basically an anomaly in world history. And the liberal democratic order is precarious because of the flaws within liberalism itself, and because of threats from the illiberal far left and the far right. So if we don't defend liberalism against relativism of values and against illiberal radical extremes, right, then we're putting essential liberties like freedom of speech in jeopardy. We can't just expect liberalism to defend itself. So finally, the third fatal flaw within liberalism and liberal democracy generally is what I talked about in my last video, and I'll put a link to that in the upper right portion of the screen, and I'll also list my sources for this video in the description. But what I talked about last time was the Iron Law of Oligarchy, as established by Robert Michaels, and I think his book was published in 1916 or 1915 off the top of my head. It's called Political Parties, and I'll link to that. So Michaels argues that liberal democratic governments can't exist without some level of bureaucracy, right? But the more bureaucratic the government, the more quickly it can become oligarchical. So Michaels is really clear that even in what starts out as the most democratic or egalitarian movements or governments, an undemocratic leadership class must always eventually emerge to control administration, knowledge, strategy, and finance. And as I discussed last time, the electorate is rarely able to prevent this process of consolidation of power by the leadership class. And that's because the electorate is disadvantaged. We are spread out geographically. We don't know what's really going on behind the scenes with the leadership, and so on. So, what does this have to do with conservatism? Conservatism seeks to defend the individual against the ever-encroaching power of the state, which is why conservatives often favor a government that is more limited in scope, which would in turn take longer to become oligarchical and undemocratic. So the more powerful the state, the more quickly it will become oligarchical and undemocratic, which is what we saw in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, just to give one example. So the conservative can immediately see why fascism and communism are dangerous to liberal democracy, right? Because they are intent on destroying traditions and settled ways of life. They subvert the individual in favor of the collective. And they empower the state so that it undermines the civil society, which allow liberalism and liberal values like freedom of speech and tolerance and equality to thrive in the first place. So that's basically all for now. I just thought that this is one point that in political philosophy that is really not well understood, and that is leading to a lot of unnecessary division in our society. So I just thought I'd touch on that. If you like this video, like I said again, please thumbs it up, share it, and subscribe to the channel. And if you subscribe, click the little bell icon and make sure it's filled in. That way you'll get notified when I post a video. So thank you so much for watching. Take care.